Good afternoon. I'm Paul Eli, Senior Fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Welcome to the Georgetown Global Dialogues, a week of events that have brought leading intellectuals from the Global South to our campus to engage with each other, with prominent US-based thinkers, with students and faculty, and with the wider public. Our goal is to foster what Pope Francis calls a culture of encounter, constructive conversations that respect differences while seeking common ground and ways forward in a divided world. There are two public sessions today. At 3:50 here in Copley Formal Lounge, a group of 4 thinkers will discuss ways to counter global intellectual inequality. Ranjit Hoskote and Nazreen Malik, who've been here with us all week, together with the philosopher K. Anthony Appiah and Negar Azimi, editor-in-chief of the journal Badoon. I'm pleased to introduce our first event, Revitalizing Democracy, the Faith Division, and its participants, Etche Temelkuran, Sohrab Ahmari, and Charles King. My own work deals mainly with literature and the arts, and in Shakespeare scholarship, if I remember it right, there are passages known as the cruxes, pieces of text whose meaning and significance are especially hard to work out, even after centuries of scrutiny. Well, in our public life in recent decades, the relationship of democracy and faith, religion, is one of the cruxes. Commentary on the topic often serves to complicate as much as to clarify. Religion is said to be the force that shaped democracy and as an historic obstacle to democracy. Religion is on the wane in democratic societies and surging in democratic societies. Religion is a source of division. It's a resource that might enable us to overcome our divisions. Religion is part of the problem and part of the solution. And in all this, what's often left out is that religion is plural, involving not religion as such, but religions, as my colleague Jose Casanova has emphasized in his landmark work, Public Religions in the Modern World. I'm going to yield to our colleague Charles King, professor of international affairs and government, and author of a number of acclaimed books, among them Extreme Politics, Nationalism, Violence, and the End of Eastern Europe, and Midnight at the Pera Palace, The Birth of Modern Istanbul. Please join me in welcoming Charles and the 2 panelists to the stage.
Thanks very much, Paul. Welcome, everyone. Before we get started, a few housekeeping issues to get us going. There are note cards for those of you who want to ask questions during the Q&A period, which will begin around 3 o'clock.
There are cards.
Yeah, the cards are coming around here.
There are no cards.
No, there are cards. The cards are coming around here. And you can write your questions on those cards and then just pass them to the outer aisles, and they'll be collected and brought up here at the appropriate time. So I'm really pleased for this panel today, which I'll introduce in a moment, to welcome 2 global thinkers on the topic at hand, that is the crisis of democracy and the faith dimension of that. Etche Temelkuran is a Turkish novelist, a political thinker, leading analyst of the erosion of democracy and the challenge of populism on a global scale. She's the author of Together, 10 Choices for a Better Now, as well as the acclaimed How to Lose a Country, The 7 Steps from Democracy to Dictatorship. Her novels are published in several languages as well. She's a frequent contributor to The Guardian, New York Times, Le Monde, and other leading outlets, and is the recipient of the PEN Translates Award and the Freedom of Thought Award from the Human Rights Association of Turkey. Sohrab Ahmari is founder and editor of Compact and a contributing writer for The New Statesman. And his writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, The New Republic, The Atlantic, Spectator, and plenty of other publications as well, including The American Conservative, for which he is a contributing editor. Ahmari's books include Tyranny, Inc., How Private Power Crushed American Liberty and What to Do About It, and The Unbroken Thread, Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an age of chaos. And thank you both for being here at Georgetown with us today.
Thank you, Charles.
So we read a lot about democracy being on a kind of global defensive, and I think plenty of people feel that instinctively. Dictators in China and Russia, autocrats in India and Turkey, nationalist populists in the United States and Europe, among the many people in power who are themselves actually elites, feeling that elite-driven democracy has run its course. Around the world, trust in democracy seems to be in the decline. Trust in the capacity of democracy to advance social, political, economic justice is on the decline. We also see at the same time a kind of rise of other forms of alternative politics, nationalism, the fusing of religious extremism and state power. All of these things seem to be on the rise. Parties and politicians have elevated a kind of authoritarian sensibility, even meanness, as a political virtue. And you can't help but look at very, very different political systems around the world and feel that an avatar of the same man has been elected to the chief political office in country after country. The virtues of politics seem to be shifting as well. So the first question for you, and Ajay, I'll throw this out to you to begin with because you've written so eloquently on many of these topics. Are we right in our diagnosis? Is there a global crisis of democracy? Is there just one process happening in country after country? Or are we wrong about the facts, much less about the prognosis and the cure?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Well, my problem with the word democracy, to begin with, is that what kind of democracy are we talking about here? There is no crisis of democracy. Actually, a form of democracy which can easily be called fake democracy is dying. There is a growing reaction against it. And this happens in morbid ways to begin with. From where I stand, very roughly, what I see as crisis of democracy, what I see in crisis of what I see as crisis of democracy is actually the crisis of a capitalist system coupled with a fake kind of democracy. It is absolutely natural and actually understandable that people lost their faith in democracy on a global level, and especially in those countries where we thought democracy is mature, well developed. Because since decades, especially after the Cold War, democracy has failed to fulfill its promises. Democracy's fundamental contract, which promises equality, has been cancelled by the contract of capitalism, which doesn't promise equality. So I think the capitalist system and its failures, or the unleashed form of capitalism which we call neoliberalism, has taken over, has prevailed over the promises of democracy. And people are reacting to this reality in different forms, be it authoritarian regimes, be it general cynicism against democracy, and at large a reaction to politics. So this is what we are seeing, actually. People are trying to find another system which actually fulfills the promises of human dignity, equality, and justice.
That's interesting. So, Sohrab, if we take that line that we've been focused on the wrong thing, that we should be listening to people on the left and on the right in country after country who are arguing that really our challenges are problems of political economy. They're not principally challenges of ideas or of leadership or a loss of faith in the governing principles of our society. It's really a crisis of a particular economic order.
Well, first of all, Charles, thank you for having me, and Tom and Pankaj for inviting me. It's delighted to share a stage with Etche. Thank you all for being here. It's remarkable the degree to which I was hoping that Etche and I would disagree ferociously, but it sounds like we're going to be in agreement, because I agree that the crisis is not a failure of democracy yielding these kind of populist leaders, but rather precisely because the neoliberal model of capitalism has depoliticized developing and developed societies around the world. Various issues that should be up for public political contestation have been removed to expert determination or the sort of impersonal workings of the market, the supposedly impersonal workings of the market, those decisions, this kind of depoliticization, has yielded a great deal of popular frustration, which is finding expression at the ballot box. So what I've tried to do in coming to terms with the wave of populist movements that erupted beginning, I would say, in the mid-2010s, is always to tell my friends who are kind of what I call in the defend democracy industry, you know, it's a kind of cottage industry of dozens of books a year about impending threats to democracy, is it's not enough to just say, you know, democracy is good. We need to meet the people in a way. Elites need to meet the people with their demands rather than, and this is so kind of a universal phenomenon of elites on both sides of the Atlantic, even like where part of the world that Etche and I are from, all elites kind of have the same language, the same tone of speaking and so on, and their tendency to write off the uncouth many with their grubby demands. And then calling that defending democracy doesn't work. And I think it inflames the rise of the kinds of genuinely scary movements and leaders that you highlighted in your opening remarks.
May I pick on?
Please, yeah.
This is getting interesting because we agree. No, this one of the beautiful sides of what we are doing here since few days is that we are genuinely talking. It's not performative art kind of thing. So I want to pick up on one word that you use. You said depoliticized. Yesterday there was a panel here. Koe was speaking to another gentleman, and I'm so sorry, I don't remember the name. And when Koe was talking about communism, he said, let's not politicize this. And I thought, here you go. The most important achievement of neoliberalism or capitalism is not this or that. It is the fact that it made us believe, or many people believe, that it's not an ideology. It's the given order, natural way of things. So many people think that this is the world. Capitalism is the world. And many people think that America is capitalism. So many people do not realize that America is bigger than capitalism and humanity is bigger than capitalism. So this is an important thing, because I do think that, like many of these, you've put nicely, the industry of democracy, debates or like productions, or the industry itself, stands upon the fact that we're going to fix democracy, but we're not going to talk about capitalism. So there are many books, and mine is one of them, How to Lose a Country. But many of those books evaded the question of capitalism. They didn't want to touch upon neoliberalism and how it actually deformed the idea of democracy. And they wanted to tell people that if we can fix one or two things here, like in the political machine, everything will be back to normal, one. And actually it outsourced the problem to the people. They have been saying that if we believe in democracy enough, you don't believe in democracy enough, that's why democracy is failing. Let's invigorate this feeling, this belief in democracy, our trust in politicians. But then, excuse me, why in the first place we lost our faith in democracy? That was the question actually that was supposed to be asked. And after Trump came to power in this country, there was this massive panic that created those books in like every day almost, like at some point.
Nice gig if you can. Huh? It's a nice racket if you can.
Yeah. And then it was like a desperate mobilization, I think. I don't know what you think, but it was a desperate move. And we watched it from the other part of the world with like pitiful eyes, to say it in a polite way. Anyway, I'll stop here. But
could I inject maybe a point of disagreement? Let me stir this a little bit, because we're downplaying the role of ideas here. That this is primarily a problem of political economy, and that's the way I phrased the question to begin with. And so that led reports in the New York Times and Washington Post in 2016 and 2020, and now to decamp to diners in West Virginia to interview the supposed great left behind. You know, why are you supporting Trump? Why are you? And the answer is always because of the economic effects of globalization, of capitalism that has no concern about redistribution or of human flourishing and so on. But it seems to me that in country after country, we're experiencing not a revolt of the great left behind, but some kind of new coalition of people who think very differently about the liberal in liberal democracy, very differently about human rights or political virtues, in coalition with a set of folks who have been left behind by globalization, by global capitalism. But it's not just the latter that we should be paying attention to.
No, not at all. I mean, like when we're talking in these panels, of course, there are patches of thinking. So I cannot really tell you the general arc of my thinking properly. It will take a lot of time. But then what they are doing, to Trump supporters or Modi supporters or Erdogan supporters, whatever, is that they are reacting to a system, but they are reacting to a system with the narrative that they have been given with. And this narrative is not, it doesn't include promises of equality or whatever. It is mostly an emotional narrative. It's politics of emotions. That's why I'm constantly working on politics of emotions lately. It tells you, or it tells the supporters that they are victims and their pride is broken. And if they come together and support this strong man, strong man will go to the power hub and defend their pride and make the elite kneel down before them. So this is the discourse, and progressives, by the way, or people like us, have been looking down upon politics of emotions for quite a long time because we thought that it's a slippery ground. You don't do politics with emotions. We have to do it with rationale, numbers, and so on and so forth. But then it was the politics of emotions that they are masters of that brought these guys to power. So it wasn't necessarily a rational argument that they use. And that victimhood was true. I mean, like partly it was because of economics and so on and so forth, the economic inequality. But it is actually, there is another bit of it, which I call manufactured victimhood, which was far more influential in terms of political result. Many of us here cannot know what the small man, I hate this word in English, but ordinary people, small men, feel in life. We can kind of approach it. We can have a glimpse of it. We can maybe even understand it, but we cannot feel it. So we do not know the urge to be part of a greater thing that they are right now, living. And these strongmen, these leaders, political leaders, promise them that, being part of a greater thing. They promise them meaning. They promise them a cause. These are the things that I think progressives or left in general have left behind gradually after the Cold War. And we should go back to these words, I think. Emotions, cause, meaning, faith that we're going to talk about. Not religion, but faith. and so on.
Saurabh,
Yeah,
emotion.
let me intervene on a couple of things
Yeah.
that have been said. The first is just to briefly to go back to the Defend Democracy cottage industry, is that in fact it's very old. In the early 19th century in the United States, as the Jacksonian uprising was roiling the country, you could listen to someone like Noah Webster, who was a figure of the old Federalist establishment, the conservative of his time, saying, liberty is lost, these kind of grotesque, grubby figures are going to kind of impose mob rule and so on. And what he was complaining about was the gradual expansion of the franchise to people without property. And I think you can hear some of the tones, that kind of tone, in a certain kind of elite response to populist uprisings around the world. On the question of, is it ideas or is it political economy that drives this? At the risk of sounding like a vulgar Marxist, and there's this guy, George Hoare, has a wonderful line, says, these days the more vulgar the Marxism, the more analytically acute. That these two are in a kind of dynamic, that what people believe, of course, is in part contoured by social structures, by how we organize our political economy, and that the kind of political economic antagonisms spin off cultural ideas and culture wars that are real enough at the level of those ideas. So to give an example, which is going to become maybe controversial here, but of course, as Paul Krugman said in an op-ed in 2006 in the New York Times, which could have been like, at the time, if I quoted you and didn't tell you this is Paul Krugman, you might think it's like Trump or Ann Coulter saying this, that the movement of vast numbers of low-wage migrants, economic migrants, of course impacts the wages and the access to public services, to the welfare net for kind of low-income, native-born workers. This is a reality that is not talked about, and it's a component of the neoliberal order, right? The free movement of everything, every barrier, national, et cetera, should submit to the free movement of goods, services, labor, and so on. If I go back to discussions about this particular issue, I don't want to make this an immigration panel, but in as recently as in the sort of aughts or the 1990s, you'd hear someone like Barbara Jordan, who was the first black woman elected to Congress from the South after Reconstruction, and was a Democrat, a protege of Lyndon B. Johnson. She chaired the then commissioned the 1995 to 1997 Commission on Immigration Reform, saying, of course, it hurts working class people at the lower ends, therefore we should be relatively closed to low-wage migration. Today, it's become the kind of progressive, the neoliberal left position that there's no problem with the absolute free movement of labor, and it tends to be good for people in our class, right? It allows them to live like the old gentry with like cheap dry cleaners, cheap nannies, gardeners, and so on. But they can wrap it up in the ideology of humanitarianism, openness, diversity, and so on. And that, at the level of ideology, that becomes a real ideological antagonism about whether humanitarianism and openness is a value we want to approach or not, or adopt or not. But then there is, at the kind of the level of the base, the antagonism between people in the professional classes who like certain kind of cheap services and people in the kind of native working class whose wages come under pressure from kind of neoliberal open borders.
Well, let me push back on that a bit, and Ezgi, you come in on this as well, that the diagnosed problem seems to be universal, or at least it exists in lots of different societies and lots of different cultures. We've been talking about that, from the United States to Turkey to Israel and plenty of other places that seem to have the same kind of political leader and the same kind of parties and elites in power in this moment in history. But the causes in each case we would think are very different. In some countries it's a reaction to immigration and wage pressures and so on. In others it's purely culture. In others it seems to be a kind of preference for this type of leadership. but the pushback in country after country is the same. So I think liberal elites, or liberals in general in the United States and Britain and Israel and plenty of other countries, aren't trying to defend their nannies and their dry cleaners. They're trying to defend a set of ideas, right? They're trying to defend individualism and the rule of law and things that seem to be under threat from an ideology of the moment rather than from a particular notion of political economy or privilege. Is that unfair?
Ideas that conveniently kind of, and I don't mean just immigration,
Yeah.
but any number of labor market tendencies work well for one class and not so well for another, and you can. Yeah. Again, I'm going to sound like a vulgar Marxist, which I'm not.
I was going to say that, but that sounds like a vulgar Marxist critique of false consciousness.
It's perfectly natural for people. You don't need to draw solely on Marx to defend your material interests on the realm of ideas. But then that doesn't mean that the realm of ideas doesn't have its own inner integrity, and that's where the vulgar Marxism gets too vulgar for me. Is that these ideas have their own inner integrity and should be can be engaged at the level of ideas. Not everything reduces purely, but yeah.
Well, I don't agree with you.
Okay.
It happened exactly the same way everywhere. It's just that the Western exceptionalism had hard time accepting this. Yeah. I left my country in 2016 because it became quite unbearable for people like me. The fear was paralyzing, so it was impossible to do any kind of intellectual work. So I moved to Zagreb. Long story, why Zagreb? But at the end of the day, I was like, on the borders of Europe, and I know what happened in Turkey. I remember very well, unfortunately. And I was, when I arrived in Zagreb, it was 2016, and it was like I was watching the same movie on a bigger screen with, more high definition kind of screen. And I was actually going around in Europe and in the United States telling that this is what's going to happen to you, friends. But then, it took them quite a long time to accept that the crisis that they're going through is similar to ours, because they thought that, oh, these things happen in Turkey because it's a majority Muslim country. These things happen in India because it's a crazy country. Oh, Italy, of course, they're Mediterranean, And then, these arguments, we're laughing, but actually this was the case, and I heard these arguments from really prominent intellectuals on really important stages. And coming from that kind of country, having this kind of accent, this kind of hair, it takes a lot of work to convince them. But then there are 7 easy steps from democracy to dictatorship, which I wrote about in How to Lose a Country. And these steps, maybe not in that order, but exactly in the same way, happen in each country. So what is the common ground? What is the common reason then? Yes, it was, as I said in the beginning, it was capitalism taking over, or capitalistic ideals taking over democracy. It's eating up what is left of democracy. And it was, people like Modi, Trump, like these are the caricatures of human cynicism, let's say. These guys, they appeared on the edges, on the margins of the world where democracy is not that mature. But then the world was as if coming to pieces from the edges, and it was getting to the center, which eventually reached the center. But then it took them a lot of time. I remember in 2016 when Trump came to power, there were really serious articles in New York Times or several other places saying that, oh, he will only last 1 year. And today there's the Supreme Court hearing about him, about his immunity. And there's the abortion ban that he gradually created. So the global solidarity against this kind of new fascism that has been rising could have been in place had the West was not so exceptionalist and didn't have the arrogance of thinking their democracies being immune to such passing by fancies like fascism. But then, you know, in all that industry of, let's save democracies, there wasn't enough criticism, and still there is not enough criticism about capitalism coupled with liberal democracy. Not many people still believe or, are not convinced enough that actually fascism, and I call it fascism, not right-wing populism anymore, fascism is actually inherently present in the neoliberal system. It's just they wanted to see, you know, those who are thinking, people like me, as paranoid, they wanted to see military boots, funny mustaches when we speak about fascism. Or armies, you know, police, and so on and so forth. But then those things, armies, you know, state violence and so on, it was necessary at the time in 1930s because there was a massive workers' movement. So the violence was the adequate response to suppress that kind of movement and bring fascism. Whereas today, there is no such massive, strong, you know, workers' movement or leftist, you know, political movements and so on. So actually, so they can actually come to power through clownish figures such as Modi or Trump. And, you know, it was really painful to watch for me. It's not a joke. It wasn't a joke. To see that American democracy that the entire world is looking up to, or we like to assume so, it came to pieces in like 4 years by this clownish figure. Because Modi, Erdogan, these are, you know, political animals. These are serious guys. And they had, you know, fascist or political Islamist, in Erdogan's case, organizations that had been there for decades. Very strong organizations, very deeply rooted organizations. Trump had nothing. Just funny hair, a television show, and then we saw the entire democratic mechanism crumbling down. And then when finally he left White House, everybody was too happy about it. And then it didn't occur to them the entire establishment, including media, had to come together to take this guy out of the White House. So this is the reason I'm telling you this, is that, okay, we have to do something globally about this. Definitely, we have to share information. And especially my part of the world has to share experience, and your part of the world share the stamina, because we are exhausted. Ask anyone from India, ask anyone from Turkey. We are emotionally, politically, in several ways, we are so exhausted because we have been living with this for more than 20 years, which this country couldn't take 4 years. But we have the experience and you have the stamina. So this is how it's going to happen. But first, we have to come to the agreement there is something wrong with the system, and the system is inhumane. It's not democracy. Let's be honest. I mean, like today in Colombia, in NYU, you see those army boots and like army gear and so on, which pretty much looks like 1984 George Orwell to me.
Well, Texas yesterday looked like Gezi Park to me. I mean, when you're looking at what was happening.
I thought the same thing. As I arrived here last week, I thought, oh, this is like Gezi Park. It's going to get bigger. It's few tents, but it always begins with few tents.
Could we
just for a question,
sorry.
I have to.
I monopolized.
I have to. I don't. I know this is a panel on the faith dimension. We should get to it.
We'll get to faith.
I can't but resist the appellation fascist kind of too easily applied to a wide range of very diverse movements. I could probably speak most seriously about the American experience, that in some ways Trump is absolutely unprecedented, but in many other ways, he is a creature of American populism and is delimited by its limitations, including its inability to project power in a way that would get us to fascism. And that, for example, again, like if you look at the Jacksonian experience, you see a similar figure in some ways. And also of the Trumpian America's overlap with Jacksonian America, broadly speaking, it makes me hesitate to say that this is analogous to a specific kind of phenomenon of Southern European authoritarianism. Or, you could if you look at pictures of FDR kind of rallies, you'd see a massive, enormous statue, the size half of this room of FDR being, kind of carried down Fifth Avenue. You wouldn't say that that's because FDR was not a fascist. And again, in terms of the policies, insofar as the Trumpian movement had a coherent policy formulation, it was the critique of free trade. It was the critique of neoliberal globalization, which at the time I was an editorial writer for the Wall Street Journal, and of course we're like, my God, it's gonna destroy the world and so on. But over time, he insisted on the tariffs. The Biden administration has kept the tariffs in place. Decoupling, or as they call it, de-risking in Europe has become conventional wisdom. Financial Times columnists are increasingly sounding like anti-globalization activists from Seattle circa 1999. And it's become a kind of consensus that we're going to have a less globalized world. We're going to have blocks, and this is the Western bloc. It's going to mean tighter labor markets, which is good for workers by definition. It's going to mean less dependence on an adversary power for basic manufacturing. All of this, strikes me, if I wouldn't say in the New Deal tradition, because Trump is not in that, but I think he's a figure in that sense of the Eisenhower-Nixon tradition of the Republican Party, which is more at peace with the New Deal, which is willing to use industrial policy in a way that the Reaganite neoliberals weren't. And so I think the appellation fascist for opposition to globalization is a mistake, especially, and then to also call every other movement of this kind under the same label, given all the sort of variegated historical realities and geographic realities, even, I would say, is a mistake.
Could at that stage, could we move on from the sort of diagnosis bit to the treatment bit? And one thing we did want to address in this panel is the kind of faith-religion dimension. We're in a university with a Jesuit heritage and a place that takes religion and the global sphere very seriously. So, Rob, is there a role in solving the political, economic problems, the issues that you identified? Is there a role for religion in this, for faith in this, or is that really part of the problem?
Absolutely, and it begins with for lack of a better word, the secular elite beginning to listen to what faith communities have to say, and that means even just beginning to learn about them. There's such a degree of religious illiteracy in the media. The only time I forced the correction at the New York Times was when the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, caught fire, and there was a story about it a couple of days later, one of those longer stories, and I noticed the curious bit. It said, and Father so-and-so, as he looked around his church, he decided to save a statue of Jesus. It's like, okay, amid the fire as things are burning down, he grabbed a statue and carried it out. Of course, it meant it was the body of Christ. The priest had told the reporter the body of Christ, meaning the Eucharist, the host.
Yeah.
But the Times reporter thought, it must be he means a body. The guy just took a giant statue out with him.
Was.
Yeah. Or in the Journal, I'm an alumnus, so maybe I shouldn't highlight this, but Bibi Netanyahu at point said, and Moses struck a rock. And the Journal wrote this as Moses struck Iraq, the modern country, right? I mention all this because there's just a vast disconnect between people of faith and the kind of biblical strand in Western life and lots of our so-called elites. So yeah, I mean, I think there's an enormous role, and I think I think back to Pope Benedict XVI and his Regensburg Address, which was much misunderstood, and I was very privileged to go on a small junket when the Holy Father, Pope Francis, visited Abu Dhabi, became the first Roman pontiff to visit the Arabian Peninsula. And actually, one of the documents associated with the visit cited the Regensburg Address. I think there's greater continuity than people imagine. The way he describes it, and it was misunderstood as a harangue against Islam, Pope Benedict there is critiquing a narrow account of reason, a narrowing of reason. What he means by that is that after he starts blaming the medieval nominalists and then the Reformation for de-Hellenizing Christianity, meaning of severing Christianity from the Greco-Roman tradition. And the reformers always thought that what the Catholic Church had done was to sort of add a kind of impure pagan element to the faith of the Bible, and that should be excised and expunged. But the result is you either end up with two things. You either end up with a very pinched account of reason that lacks, is a kind of soulless pinched account of reason that says the only questions which are subject to public reason are those having to do with things we can either sense with our senses or measure with scientific instruments and generally express in mathematical language. Or you end up with fundamentalist faith, because you've removed faith, if you've removed the element of reasonableness from faith, so you end up with fundamentalism. And both are bad options. And what it means is that in terms of our public reason, the ethical voice of the monotheistic traditions is lacking, because what they say about, for example, things like political economy or anything else can only register as a species of private bias. It's like, oh, that's nice, you believe that in your church, whatever. But here we're dealing with public reason, and by the way, what we call public reason is a very, very narrow thing. So, and Benedict warned that the deeply religious peoples of the world, and he didn't just mean Christians, of course, take offense to that. And they don't feel like their vernacular for talking about justice, about ethics, and so on, makes it to the public square, is not respected in the public square, and that could express itself potentially in explosive ways. So the first thing is, I think, in terms of prescriptions, is not just religious literacy for journalists, but actually a willingness to rethink the degree to which we've narrowed the scope of reason to exclude, final causes, to exclude questions about meaning, as Etche said.
But if you follow thinkers on the Catholic right, for example, like Patrick Deneen, their plan for the future is a real flipping of the script when it comes to the private and public spheres and the role of faith and religion in this reformed, post-regime change, as Deneen puts it, new order that ends up looking very much like authoritarian systems like Turkey, which is to say, rather than carving out private spheres in a school or a business where you can express your religious practice in whatever way you want, the script would be flipped, and that religion would be the default option, right? Religion would be the default in the public sphere, and then we would carve out little spaces for the secularists to express their secularism. But that's a very different understanding of what liberal democracy is. I mean, what is the relationship between secularism in the public sphere and liberal democracy as a political ideal?
Is that from your? I've been talking a lot.
Maybe you could say something about that, and then Edge, can we come to you?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I cannot speak as a general person of faith. I can only speak as a person who believes that one religion is true. But in that religion, in the tradition of that religion, it's impossible to partition questions about human beings' ultimate end from how we organize our politics, right? That in the attempt to partition the two, we're already staking a spiritual claim. And the Second Vatican Council does not do that. So it still accepts the importance of kind of an integral development of the human person and of the human community, requires the voice of the faith and I would say of the church. But what that looks like under conditions of modernity and pluralism is in a society like this, like the church has not necessarily given up on the idea of a confessional state. But that doesn't mean that Pope Francis is running around demanding confessional states. And I think that's very important. The specific legal forms and practices of Catholicism in trying to bring the voice of the church into the public square will look different than they did under, St. Louis or under Pius IX. There's certain things that happened in the unfolding of history and modernity, and you have the Second Vatican Council declaring unequivocally that religious freedom is an absolute right? Again, can of course within the limits of the common good and so on. But so the legal practices of what the flipping of the script might look like needn't look like theocracy, because that's mad and insane and cruel. But are there other forms in which there could be an integration of the realms? Sure, and it wouldn't look like, we have to look at our own American tradition. So for most of this country's history, we had a Sabbatarian tradition, right? It goes back to colonial times. George Washington was cited by a magistrate. He got a ticket for riding his horse, from Connecticut to New York while he was president. And that Sabbatarian tradition continued through the 19th century, and it was, the one area where they failed to impose the kind of Sabbath was on public post offices on Sundays. They couldn't do that. Congress resisted that until the labor movement came along, and evangelicals and the nascent labor movement worked together to fight for the Sunday off. Is that Erdogan's Turkey? Is that totalitarianism? In order to believe that, you'd have to believe that vast numbers of our ancestors, American ancestors, lived under a totalitarian or authoritarian regime, and I don't think that's true. I think it is true by the way, of African Americans, but that's the separate question. I think as far as for much of the history, where the white majority is concerned, the experience of a Sabbatarian tradition was not felt as a authoritarian imposition. And so there's a risk in a kind of liberal mentality of framing all of the past as, this realm of darkness. That there was, only until about 2016 when people, 2009, when people began to live a fully, enlightened life. I think that's dangerous.
What Sohrab does is equating religion to basic morality, I think. And that I cannot agree with. Faith, by the way, when I speak of faith, I don't speak of religion. I have nothing to do with religion when I speak of faith. And it is political faith, what I'm talking about. And very roughly, my train of thought goes like this. Neoliberalism defines human being as a selfish, self-centered bastard. And we have been subjected to the worst of our kind constantly, both in politics and social sphere. Throughout the decades, we have lost our faith in humankind because we have been told that we cannot change anything. This is the given order, this inequality, injustice, and lack of dignity. What today in Colombia, in universities, young people are trying to actually get back that faith. They want to show themselves and to the others that things can be changed. So they are refreshing our faith in humanity and their own faith. And if we have to have not any kind of a proper kind of democracy, we have to have faith in politics and human beings. And if we want to change the world or, solve the climate crisis, be against fascism, we have to believe each other. But in order to do that, we have to see the beauty in humankind. And to see the beauty means believing in people, believing in humankind, and so on and so forth. But I have problems with religion for several reasons, political reasons, moral reasons, and so on. But I also understand what Sohrab is saying in terms of, can religious groups come together with progressive groups to change things for the better? Of course. I know some American friends are trying to get together with evangelicals to get a proper action plan for climate crisis. So that is possible. But then religion or religious groups are not the only way to bring basic human morals and basic human values to politics. I reject that part of the argument because I think morality has been monopolized by religion, and capitalism has always been very, very comfortable with this, outsourcing, so to speak. But then the problem is then faith in humankind, faith in ourselves, faith in each other that we have in each other have been confined within the church, within the mosque, and so on. Every time I go to a church, well, as a woman, going into a mosque is quite problematic. So whenever I go to a church, I envy. Because as soon as you enter from the door, you are welcomed. There is kindness, there is generosity. It reminds me, we talked before the panel and there was a discussion at the dinner table last night. It reminds me of a revolutionary moment that I witnessed in Tahrir or in Gezi uprising in 2012 and 13. Overnight, when those uprisings happened, and probably right now in some university campuses there is that sense as well. Overnight, people in great numbers decided to be good. Like, no boundaries. Let's be good to each other, generous, kind. And it was as if there was a race to be better human beings. There was this love all around. So it is not only church or religious communities that we can experience this, experience and exercise the beauty of human being. We can also exercise it in the revolutionary moment. It's just that, religious communities or church or, religious places kind of a priori offers this. It's institutionalized form. But then that institution coming from, majority Muslim part of the world, religion doesn't resonate as kindness, generosity, or anything else. Especially as a woman, I cannot say such things about religion. It feels like betraying my kind, so to speak. But having said that, in your previous bit, you were talking about something that reminded me of women, religion again. First of all, I have to say this, Christianity has been, not Christianity, but church has been a great collaborator to fascism in the 1930s. And when discussing democracy, those crazy countries like Muslim countries, they can have that kind of authoritarian leaders and so on. That debate, when that debate was happening, many people think that it's because we are Muslim that we are losing our democracy. And I told them, in 1930s, you were Christian still and you had fascism. So I'm going to kind of stitch this thought to the fact that this country has great churches. I am sure millions or thousands of whatever, amazing religious leaders as well. But this country has also jeopardized women's lives through abortion law. That is a big problem. Why? Because fascism does not come in goose steps. It first targets women everywhere. This is the same throughout the history. We are like canaries in a mine in that sense. And when that happens, how religious communities react becomes the ultimate litmus paper of the separation between basic human morals and religion. And that's why when I speak of faith, I don't speak about religion or religious institutions. I speak about our need and our capacity to create this faith in ourselves through politics and through the kindness and generosity and the love of politics. It is not easy for me to speak about love, generosity, and kindness and not smirk about it, because I come from the rough part of the world. And I'm afraid of appearing naive. I've seen wars, I've seen torture, I've seen imprisonment, I lost my friends. You know, in several parts of the world, I saw horrible things. But then going back to your initial question, like what is the solution? It is love, radical love in politics. And we can only do it by believing in ourselves. If any religious community want to join, please be welcome. But let's talk about, what do you think about abortion? What do you think about women being equal and so on and so forth?
I oppose abortion.
Huh?
I oppose abortion, but so I have to say that, and I think that's linking opposition to abortion to fascism per se, again, I think is irresponsible, because it would paint, vast swaths of the...
No, it's a fact.
I don't want to go down.
It's a
I don't want to go
fact.
down that road if we can, because we do need to move on to some student questions in our Q&A
All right.
period, if that's okay. Saurabh, can I throw this out to you to begin with? This takes us in a slightly different and I think very interesting direction. What factors have contributed to young voters' disillusionment with democracy? How can faith in democracy be revitalized in a generation with growing fears of climate change, economic uncertainty, global instability?
I mean, the reasons for disillusionment, I think we've addressed quite thoroughly, including in our disagreements and our agreements, and areas where Etche and I agree. I think that what we have today, and here I'll step away from these kind of religious questions, what we have today is a low-wage, high-benefit society. And it's the worst kind of political economy. And when I say high benefits, it doesn't mean that the welfare system in the United States is particularly, or increasingly across much of the developed world, is particularly generous. It's not. It's a thin welfare net, and it's miserly, and it's means tested in various ways. It just means that as the share of income that working class people need to make ends meet, welfare takes up a high proportion. So half of fast food workers rely on public welfare. About a quarter of college adjunct professors rely on some form of public welfare, or their households do. And so what that means is we have an economy in which, unless you can sort of claw your way to one of the sort of the professional jobs, of which there aren't enough, you face an abyss. You face an abyss of precariousness. And I think this has, at some nexus, there's some nexus between this and the kind of cultural convulsions of recent years. That, in other words, if I've been told to go to college, I've taken on $150,000, $200,000 in debt, and the degree that I achieved is not sufficient for me to get the kind of job that would actually allow me to pay off that debt, let alone start a family, buy a house, et cetera, then I will compete ferociously for those few jobs, and I will assert my identitarian grievances, and the other person will assert their contrary identitarian grievances. So this is the source of, I wouldn't say it's disillusion, it's a source of anxiety and rancor in our societies. And so, we need to rethink our political economy, and I think Etche and I would largely agree about what that means. Higher union density, a thicker welfare net, or restoring some of the welfare net that the neoliberals thinned out. With the role of faith in this, I think here's how I would put it: that when I said that religion, or especially the kind of classical and Christian tradition, has an account of public reason, that includes an account of the human person as not an atom. It includes an account of the human person as naturally social. In other words, where liberalism says you are an atom thrown into a chaotic world and at war with other atoms, and out of this ceaseless clash of atoms, the human good will spontaneously emerge. When that account came, it came as a shock, a rupture to traditional societies, which had all insist that human beings are naturally social, naturally political. The common good is not an imposition; it's what we naturally do. So that's what I think that's what the voice of the church specifically is now sitting as the kind of, let alone the deposit of faith, it's the deposit of kind of an older reason that sees human beings as naturally social and political. That's a source of resistance against kind of the neoliberal logic. It leads to, for example, Pope Francis's vast and very important kind of corpus of social teaching, whether it's on climate change and Laudato Si, or his anger about global elites. He often talks about, who have no sense of community, no sense of care for the weak, and would treat the weak and the poor as things you can discard. This, I think, is also the voice of religion. And if you're worried about right-wing populism, that is, as I'm quoting my friend Ross Douthat here, if you're worried about right-wing populism that's religious, wait till you see the post-religious variety. Because what's simmering there, and it terrifies me, is the kind of Nietzschean, neo-pagan politics of strength worship, eugenics, IQ, et cetera, et cetera. And traditional faith is a bulwark against that, because it says human beings have an inherent dignity. Doesn't matter what your IQ is or what your abilities are. You're a child of God.
This comes on to another really interesting student question. I think one of the concerns is that religion in its forms gets denuded as it moves into the political sphere, gets denuded of all of those positive elements that you were just talking about, Sohrab. I mean, we see this with American evangelicals who report attending religious services far less than in a previous generation, but they're more fervent in their identity and more fervent in their support for Donald Trump, for example. And I think that's rather true in other religious traditions as well, once it becomes politicized. A student has asked, so what role should, and I'll edit this a little bit, positive nationalism, and we might even say other forms of identity, that we might be worried about, versus an international solidarity play in reviving faith in democracy? So the question is about nationalism, but we might extend it to religion, faith, any other kind of identity communities. You want to take this?
Yeah, sure.
We'll come back to Sohrab.
Do you want to go first?
No, you go first. I gave like 2 answers in a row.
No, I'm enjoying listening to you. Nation states are falling. I mean, like, United States is a different place, of course. Whenever I come here, I have to translate myself to America. Sort of. We were talking about this, Veronica, the other day. It's a completely different vocabulary you use and a different way of asking questions. So it's always a split of a second. I go baffled, like, what is he asking to me? So this is a different mindset. In a weird way, I can't really explain it. But anyway, but nation states are falling, and we are suffering from that fact in Europe. Individuals and the underprivileged actually suffering mostly. But I see individuals going through this incredible odyssey through the borders, and in them I see a new world beginning to shape. And many of these people come from those countries that are lost, or look lost for now. They come from, Asian countries. They come from Turkey, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and so on and so forth. Some of these countries literally, the soil is dispersed. Some of these countries are lost to fascism. Some of these countries are lost to economic demise, and so on. So many people are coming to Europe having lost countries, and they're making new homes in Europe. United States is different in that sense, as far as I can see. I mean, it is more like when you're here, you're already at home, in a way. Yesterday, I met a Turkish guy who told me it's different being in the United States than in Europe, When you're here, you come here on the day of arrival almost, you're American. And you're not a foreigner. Whereas in Europe, you're still a foreigner. So nation states matter still in Europe. I don't think necessarily here. But then, I think a new form of home, both political and philosophical, a new form of home is shaping in Europe, and that home will also serve as a political inspiration. So about what is to come next.
You mean
for
this
realm.
pan-European that is higher than the nation state? Or?
Well, people, the underprivileged people are on the front lines of this, this transformation, let's say. We are transforming from nation states to something else. That's why, there is this make our country great again, let's put the walls, then higher walls, and then higher walls, and so on. That is all because the nation states are falling apart, the borders are, coming into pieces. That's why the reaction is there. And it won't help, of course, because the transformation has already begun. But it's only those underprivileged people feel how it feels like to be in the front lines of this transformation. And it is those people who are going to come up with the new ideas and new ways of doing politics, new ways of believing in each other, new ways of coming together despite our differences. Because they are foreigners, because they are strangers, and they're strangers to each other, and they are supposed to live together. Like, there's no other option. So I think the new politics, new faith, democracy is a very small word when it comes to these big issues, I think, but new democracy, they're going to produce it, I think.
Interesting. Sohrab, the role of nationalism in all of this.
So I don't see nation states as just a fact about the world going away. I think in some ways they are hardening, and in one sense there's a logic to them. I sympathize with the French thinker Pierre Manon when he says that the sort of liberal kind of subject, the cosmopolitan liberal subject, is too small and selfish for me, and humanity at large is too large. But the nation state is sort of like the intermediate. That's a decent level of political attachment. Decent, reasonable, realistic. On the other hand, nationalism as a principle on its own can get unbelievably ugly and terrible. I've been reporting on the ethnic cleansing of the territory the Armenians call Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh, been going there, which more or less has been emptied of its Armenian population. And what's really interesting is, as I go through the kind of South Caucasus, with no love lost for the Soviet Union, but you see that in an environment like this, a kind of large, capacious, multinational grouping is less likely to lead to sort of ugly national. Now, of course, the Soviets did a terrible job because they didn't allow their various nationalities to talk directly to each other. You had to always go through Moscow, so that even though Azeris and Armenians were intermarrying and in some ways had developed a kind of common life together, the minute the Soviet center began to crumble, and actually it really began to, in terms of the peripheries, it really began to crumble in Armenia and Azerbaijan, it went away, and the kind of ferocious nationalisms that had been frozen really since World War I came back and are still, as one of the women I interviewed who'd been exiled from Artsakh told me, the blood doesn't run dry. Nation states are a reality, but I think, especially as people of faith, and here again I can't just speak generally, but as a Catholic, I can't lose sight of that universality, right? The idea that, in a sense, who is my neighbor? Everyone. That's as I was talking to Tom, that's the kind of radical call of the gospel. But then to prudently think, how do I serve my neighbor? That's a question of prudence. If I want the working class in the developed world, roughly speaking, to do well, and I want to see a renewal of the social and Christian democratic traditions, that may mean a world that's a little bit more limited because globalization ravages those kinds of solidarities. But then that means I have an obligation to try to serve the people outside the Western bloc in other ways, through developmentalism, through aid, and so on. But these tensions are real, between the kind of universal, the national, and especially if you're engaged in a kind of project of political solidarity.
There's another question that follows on nicely from that, and it takes us back to first principles in a way. And so when we start with you on this, and we'll come to Ajay, does every form of government have to be democratic? Can there be a stable country economically, socially, politically that can thrive without establishing democratic institutions? If the defense of democracy is a cottage industry, should that be just rolled up, I guess?
Here's how I would answer that. The goal of political community is to secure the common good of the whole. And that's the classical definition. Why do we form political communities? To secure the common good. That means the goods that we can't have but through communal collective action, and which aren't diminished by being shared. In other words, if we have peace, if I have a bit more peace, that I don't diminish your peacefulness. If I have more justice, I don't diminish your access to justice. So this is the classical definition of the common good. And so now, how to secure the common good? I think after the experience of the rise of capitalism and the kind of rise of political economic modernity, I think that democracy, political democracy, especially in a kind of social and Christian democratic model, is the best approximation of the classical account of the common good, because it brings classes into kind of compromise, right? I often begin by quoting Pope Leo XIII's, the opening of Pope Leo XIII's encyclical on Capital and Labor, Rerum Novarum, but I don't tell audiences who said this. So I'll be like, oh, well, of course, as Marx wrote in the Grundrisse, classes are forming, a few rich are depriving the poor, and so on. And especially in Catholic audiences, they go on. I'm saying, no, actually, that wasn't Marx. That was Pope Leo. I don't know where I was going with that, but the point is that this is the reality. But the difference between Marxism and Catholicism is that Marxism aims to heighten the antagonisms until one class destroys the other, where I think that the kind of Catholic and really the social Christian democratic tradition aims at class reconciliation. And that means often restraining the power of the elite by the democratic power of people from below. And that process, I think, which for me, that's the definition of democracy, is the closest approximation of the classical account, and therefore I'm pretty small d democratic.
Ajay?
Well,
Is democracy necessary?
Well, if you starve people enough and terrify them enough, of course, democracy becomes a luxury. No, seriously. This country, whenever I come to the United States, I'm kind of enchanted because it's still not easy to talk about these things in the United States, I think. Being anti-capitalist is still seen as being the village fool or something like that. Talking about abortion is a problem, you see. It's interesting. The thing is, I don't know when I watched this, but I watched this documentary about China at some point. It was years ago. And then the guy was asking the Chinese worker, like, but then you don't have democracy. And he looked at the guy and said, like, so what? I'm not hungry anymore. So if you starve them enough, democracy becomes a luxury. But then if you terrify them enough, democracy becomes a luxury as well, as it happens in this country, for instance. They terrify people with the strangers, like, immigrants, foreign powers, China, Russia, and so on and so forth. And then, we know this. There's this security obsession and so on. And then, of course, democracy becomes luxury. But then the problem with that is that human dignity becomes a luxury too. And many people think that, it's like pride, because pride is a different thing, but they sound alike, like pride and dignity, as right-wing populists do say. Pride, you can mend your pride by putting down on another person, but then dignity is a concept inherently assumes that we are one as humankind. So when your dignity is less, the other person's dignity is less as well, and the other way around too. I think what's happening in the United States, especially among the young people today, is actually recognizing the fact that if other people's dignity is damaged, we cannot be wholly, entirely human either. So they are actually protecting their dignity. So they are saying to the world that human dignity, thus democracy, is not a luxury, and we are here to defend it. So I'm constantly trying to bring the subject, as you might have noticed, to what's happening about Gaza in universities in the United States and so on and so forth, because it feels absolutely uncomfortable to me to be talking about these things and not connecting them to what's happening in the United States, around Europe, in the rest of the world in terms of Gaza. We are all trying to, I think, prove that we still have some value, like basic human value, and we do not want to watch children being killed, especially if it's in our name and with our money and so on. So, yeah, we're talking about democracy, and it's so funny to hear that, like, all this aid from the United States, for instance, going to Israel under the name of, or within the context of protecting a democracy in Middle East and so on and so forth. These are heartbreaking things. These are things that makes you like naturally react as a human being. So, yeah, but then if you're terrified enough and you're starved enough, of course it becomes a luxury to think about these things, to talk about these things.
We've only got about 7 minutes left, and I do want to take at least one more question here. And it has to do with how we square up politics as being about the struggle for power, about the ability to determine public policy and foreign policy and so forth, with the capacity to see beauty, dignity, love, solidarity, all the things that Ece was talking about. How do we square up those two things? Practical politics versus the more positive emotions that you were saying should lie at the center of a politics of dignity. Well,
You want to go first?
No, I'll go back.
why don't you start and then we'll come to Saurabh.
Yeah, sure. Democracy, the way we are practicing it right now, this representative democracy is a very old, not very old, but rather old practice. We're in 21st century, and the political machine that we built somewhere in 19th century does not really connect, it doesn't apply to today's problems and so on. So it has to be a different system. And then we also, but this is not that important. The most important part is the system that we built, especially after the Second World War, does not work. And we know that it doesn't work because UN is like a idiotic giant. And, when people kill each other, or when, Palestinians are killed, it is just watching with deep concern. Very, very concerned. And then so much concerned you cannot imagine that kind of, it goes on. And there is no power there. So we try to put this thing together to keep our basic morals, like, the minimum morals, and it doesn't work. And then we have International Court of Justice. It doesn't work. It was amazing, that South Africa initiated that process about Gaza, but then so what? So that doesn't work either. And law is minimum ethics. Like when you don't have ethics, you go to law. Like when you cannot trust each other's ethics, you go to court. So we couldn't do that as humanity, obviously. And especially young people, I think they're seeing this, like it's not happening. European Union, I'm not even talking about that, how incompetent it is and so on. And several other institutions can be listed like this. I guess democracy, especially with the young generation, will operate something like this. I see this structure, this international and national structures of democracy, democratic structures, let's say, as a sunk ship, a shipwreck. It's dead. But then, then fish and other creatures of sea come together and start shoaling around. And then they transform the shipwreck into a reef, a living organism. I think this structure will be taken over by new forms of politics, by new demands of politics. And then we're going to have a new political structure. What I noticed is after I came here, especially after interacting with students, some of them here, I guess, is that we are so backward. We assume things about them, and it's not true. I know young people in Europe, but I didn't know them in the United States. So it was quite refreshing for me to see that they are so already very radical. Like, I wouldn't imagine that we're going to talk about communism in this place with a room packed with people, or socialism. And, seriously, think about it. It was impossible 10 years ago. And now they are open-minded. They are not like sailors from Middle Age. No, seriously, because 10 years ago it was like that. People considered end of capitalism as if it's end of the sea. We're going to fall from the world as humanity altogether. So they're not like that.
More comment in from Sohrab too.
Yeah. So I'm happy to hear, to see that things are improving, and this new world is in the making.
Interesting.
So the question was, how do you reconcile politics, which is the quest for power, or involves the quest for power, and a politics of love, or a vision of love and dignity? And I have enormous respect for the American founding. I think it's the sort of genius for statesmanship is remarkable. But there's one statement that is indelibly sort of marked in the American soul by the founders, which I disagree with, and that is, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. In a more classical and Christian account, even the angels hierarchically govern each other. And even before the fall, there was government, right? This is the kind of Augustinian way of thinking about it. So that if you see human beings, again, as naturally political, and political order, sociality as not like an imposition that is imposed on demonic beings, right? That's the opposite of the angel, but rather something that we do naturally, then the exerting of political authority, or the push and pull of power and counterpower, doesn't just become this kind of brute thing, but can, at its best, work hand in hand and actually promote love and dignity and so on.
I think that's a good place to end. We're at time now. The next session will start in 15 minutes. There's coffee in the back, and you're invited to stay around for the break. Please join me in thanking Ece and Sohrab for a really terrific discussion. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Teşekkür. Teşekkür.